Hello. Maybe you can guess from where I am, but today we are going to talk about compost. We are going to talk about a few different things today. First, what is compost? We all know generally what it is, but what's going on behind the scenes. Second, what your backyard compost needs to be effective and why. And last, I'm going to show you how I built this one, which I just finished today, and why I chose this structure. And maybe you can learn a few tips. I'm not an expert, so if any of you are compost experts, feel free to give me some feedback and let me know what I might want to do. All right, let's go. We are diving into the magical world of compost. Let's figure out what's going on inside that compost pile. Most of you probably know that compost is a big mixture of stuff, organic stuff, but it has to be a mixture. Why is that? You probably intuitively know that a pile of apples won't decompose quickly into the kind of compost you want for your garden, and it would probably be gross. Same is true for a pile of old hay. It would eventually decompose, but it wouldn't happen quickly, and it wouldn't create that great nutrient-rich compost that you want for your garden. Why is that? The answer has to do with who is responsible for breaking down that organic material in your compost pile and what they need to survive. A compost pile creates the perfect environment for certain kinds of bacteria to become active. A good compost pile has the correct combination of nutrients and reaches the correct temperatures for these bacteria to rapidly break down organic material and create the nutritious soil that is so good for our plants. Initial decomposition is carried out by mesophilic microorganisms. Mesophilic means that these organisms like moderate temperatures of about 65 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The decomposition process of these bacteria releases heat as a byproduct, and this extra heat increases the temperature of the pile. At these higher temperatures, mesophilic bacteria are replaced by thermophilic bacteria, which like temperatures of about 110 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. These bacteria are able to break down proteins, fats, and complex carbohydrates quickly. The activity of these bacteria is why material in a compost pile breaks down so much more quickly than just a pile of apples or a pile of hay. So how do you keep that bacteria happy? There are a few primary factors that you should consider if you want to make your own backyard compost: oxygen, moisture, and good nutrient ratios. We'll talk a little bit about each of these. The bacteria you want for compost are aerobic or oxygen-loving bacteria. Decomposition by these bacteria is an aerobic process, meaning they need oxygen to effectively break down organic material. So if we remove oxygen, what happens? Anaerobic bacteria will take over the decomposition process. These bacteria don't need oxygen to break down organic material, but the trade-off is that it's a much slower process. It's also a much smellier process. The anaerobic breakdown process releases hydrogen sulfide, which is the culprit behind that rotten egg smell. You often get this smell when you slog through deep mud or wetlands, and that's because the bacteria in those environments is anaerobic bacteria. The soil there is too wet to allow for sufficient oxygen for aerobic processes. So you want to keep aerobic bacteria happy, so this just means you need to make sure there's enough air in your compost pile. You can keep enough air in there by adding bulky material like sticks. So just every once in a while, put a layer of sticks in your compost pile. Your compost pile should be damp. Bacteria need some water to survive, and a lot of moisture is lost during the decomposition process. If the pile is too dry, bacteria will become dormant and decomposition will cease. If your pile is too wet, bacteria will be smothered due to the lack of oxygen, and smelly anaerobic processes will take over. Let's move on to the last element of good compost that we'll talk about today: good nutrient ratios. You often hear this referred to as a good mixture of greens and browns. These colors refer to nitrogen and carbon. Nitrogen is necessary for the creation of proteins, genetic material, and cell structure. Carbon, often called the building block of life, is the main source of energy for bacteria. I've put a little key in the corner to remind you which element corresponds to which color. If you do some research into composting, you'll often come across the 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. But what does this mean in a practical sense for someone creating a backyard compost pile? This ratio doesn't refer to volume. You don't need 30 times as much brown material as green material. This ratio refers to the chemical composition of the pile. In practical terms, you will probably need a pile that is 2 parts green and 1 part brown. This may change slightly depending on what you're using for your carbon and nitrogen sources, but this is a good place to start. If you have too much nitrogen, the bacteria won't be able to use it all and the excess will be released as smelly ammonia. If you have too much carbon, the bacteria won't be able to function efficiently and the decomposition process will slow down. That was a lot of information, and you likely won't make a perfect compost pile on the first try. This is my first time composting too, so I made a little cheat sheet for myself with potential solutions to problems I might face. If my pile's too smelly, I might add more carbon. I could make sure my pile is aerated and make sure it's not too wet. If it's too slow, I can add more nitrogen and make sure it's moist. I'm starting my pile with dried leaves as a carbon source and food scraps as a nitrogen source because those are the things I have the most of, and I'll see if it works. Now I'll show you how I built my compost bin. Hello from the grounds of my soon-to-be constructed compost bin. I've never done this before, so I'm taking you on this journey to show you that if I can figure out how to build this from free stuff I find and stuff in my garage, then you can too. And so let's try. From my YouTube research, I found that using old pallets is a time-effective and or lazy way to build compost bins. It is a whole wall built for you already, so you don't have to connect a bunch of old scrap wood. You just need 3 to 4 sides and you are good to go. I found these on Craigslist Free. It was my first excursion into the world of Craigslist Free, and it went well. I just picked them up from an old construction site where they were advertising 20 free pallets, and there were actually a lot of advertisements for a bunch of old free pallets, so I think it's a really good way to find some if you're looking for them, because if you just buy them, they're actually shockingly expensive. So I have 3 of these right now. My plan is to build a very simple, just 3-walled compost bin. It's not going to be completely enclosed, and the reason I'm not adding a 4th wall is because I do want to have easy access to the compost. We'll see if creatures get in there, and if so, I can always add a 4th wall if I want. And then it's also easier to turn or aerate if you only have 3 walls. So we'll see how it goes. This pallet is a little too tall for my bin, so I'm just going to saw through this first half to make it a little shorter. But remember, you always got to be safe and cool. So these 2 pallets are going to be the back and one side of the compost bin, and I'm just going to use a drill to screw into one side and through this side of this pallet. If I wanted to make it really secure, I could use brackets to put in the corners, the top and bottom, but I don't have brackets and I don't want to go out and pay for one, and I don't need it to be super secure, I don't think. If it starts to fall apart, I'll reconsider, but I just need it to be a standing structure, and I'll reevaluate if it starts to fall apart. The issue I did run into that I didn't foresee is that if you're doing it this way without the little brackets that you put on the inside, is that you need pallets that have some space so that you can kind of get in there and try and screw them together. Like if I had been trying to screw them together from this side, I wouldn't be able to because I can't reach through these slats and wouldn't be able to get the drill to the other side easily. I was lucky enough that these other pallets have some spaces there, but that might be a problem you run into if you try to do it this way. So I've got 2 sides of the compost bin together, and now I just need to use the drill to screw these sides together. So I attached the 3 full sides together, and I decided I do want something in the front to keep the pile contained. So I decided to add half a side. I just cut one of the pallets in half, and I'm going to screw this 4th mini wall into the full compost bin now. If animals or something start to get into it, I can add something on the top, maybe some chicken wire, which is kind of my prime concern, so we'll just see what happens. It's done! Now it's just ready for all of our food scraps and dry leaves and grass clippings, and then it can get to work. Right here I've got 3 piles of things I'm going to add to get the compost started. I've got some sticks, some dried leaves, and the beginnings of our compost bucket. So I'm adding these sticks to create some nice interstitial spaces in the compost pile, which will create pockets for oxygen to come in and help all of those awesome aerobic decomposition processes happen. Without that, there might be a lack of oxygen and things will not decompose, and you'll start to get that bad smell. Second, the pile of leaves. Those are my browns. Those will be the nice carbon sources, and we have a bunch around here, so I think dead leaves will be the majority of what I use for carbon. And then finally, just the beginnings of our food scraps from the kitchen. We don't have many yet, but I'll put them in there just to start. So I've got a nice layer of sticks, then covered them in dead leaves, and then I added our very small pile of scraps from the kitchen. So periodically we'll add to that. I think typically I'll wait until the garage bucket is filled a little bit more before bringing it out here. But there we go. And I'm just going to cover these a little bit with leaves just to block their scent a little bit in case they attract animals. Hopefully, what I've read is that they aren't that attracted as long as you keep out meat and dairy. So fingers crossed. So there you go. There is the bin. I bet a lot of you watching are veteran composters. So if you have any great tips or tricks, feel free to let us all know in the comments. And I'm sure I'll learn along the way about what I did right or wrong. But I made it, and here it is, and so now we won't be throwing out all of our scraps.